Now it's time for a perspective on life from Paris. And after the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, much courting went on between the West and Russia. Hopes that its surge towards democracy and integration with the West could lead to real cooperation. But already, relations between the West and Russia were a cynical case of self-deception. That's the opinion and premise, indeed, of a new book which looks at how the relationship, particularly between Europe and Russia, has developed since then and how Russia now courts the European far right as it aims to destabilise Western governments and push governments into more Eurosceptic positions. Russia and the Western far right, Tango Noir, is written by author Anton Shekhovtsov, who's also external lecturer at the University of Vienna. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme today. Let's go back, wind the clock back, if you like, first of all, then. Talk about that point in 1991. There was so much hope at that point, wasn't there, that Russia and the West could come much closer together. But in the book, you really argue that it was never really going to happen.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Well, indeed, in 1991, there were so many hopes that Russia would join the Western community somehow. And if you remember, there was this idea of the end of history, that liberal world won the Cold War, so all the nation would somehow join this post-Cold War order. But this didn't happen. And if you look at the post-Soviet space, for example, already in 1991, 1992, Russia had its first post-Cold War and post-Soviet war, occupying parts of Moldova. And that happened under Yeltsin, under President Boris Yeltsin, who was considered to be a Democrat by the Western community. And also so many things that were happening in Russia and around Russia that the West basically ignored or self-deceived itself about the developments. And Russia was hardly ever democratic in the post-Soviet period. And then gradually, it started also to expand its influence. It started to happen, of course, after, I would say, the first presidential term of Vladimir Putin. But the roots of illiberal democracy, of illiberalism, lie indeed in the 90s.
And then you talk in the book about how over the last 30 years it's gradually, as you said there, moved towards that position. Well, we've now got Russia very much courting the more far-right parties across Europe, really, in a range of different countries.
Oh, this is true. But we must understand that there are two objectives that the Kremlin has when it's courting the far right. First, it needs, for its own media, for state-controlled media, it needs a friendly approach towards Russia to show to the Russian society that although there are sanctions against Putin's regime, still there are some Europeans who are quite friendly towards Russia. And since I would say 2014, after the aggression against Ukraine, after the annexation of Crimea, too few mainstream politicians in the West would be happy to offer this praise of Putin's Russia. And only far right, far left representatives, some isolationists or Eurosceptics would still be ready to offer this praise. So this is one objective. This is for the domestic Russian audience. And another, of course, objective is to undermine the West, undermine the European Union, to subvert the liberal consensus in the European Union. Of course, there are many problems in the EU itself that have nothing to do with Russia. But at the same time, Russia is trying to exacerbate those problems, to make them even, to make them even worse. And why it is doing so is because the European Union is such a strong structure that only because of the EU, the sanctions, for example, can hold. If those were individual countries that would try to impose those sanctions, of course, they would not succeed, because on the bilateral level, Russia would most likely win the argument. But with the EU, it's very difficult for Russia to expand its malign influence in the Western community.
And as we saw from that front page of your book, the front cover shows that picture there with Vladimir Putin standing right next to Marine Le Pen, of course, the French far-right leader. Why did you necessarily pick Marine Le Pen? Is it just the best example of a far-right leader that worked with the premise of the book, if you like?
Well, essentially, Marine Le Pen was the first far-right leader in the European Union that had the opportunity to meet with Vladimir Putin officially. And that was, I think also a very symbolical photo, because it was taken just 1 month before the first round of the presidential elections in France. And that was a very clear message on the part of the Kremlin that in the standoff between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen was the Kremlin's candidate. That was a very clear message, and I thought it was a very good, again, symbolical representation of the topic of my book.
And assuming all this philosophy which you're talking about is true, I mean, do you think other Western leaders, how worried do you think they should be, if you like, of that connection between Russia and the far right?
Well, I think there are reasons to worry. But also, I would say that for the Kremlin, cooperation with the far right has always been a plan B. The plan A is to corrupt mainstream politicians, people who are already in power. If it doesn't work for them, then only then they would try to court the far right. And again, the French example gives a very clear picture of this. For example, in 2017, or even before, in 2016, the Kremlin would be happy to support François Fillon, or at least not to do anything to somehow hinder his candidacy. They would not have supported Le Pen had Fillon not been tarnished by the scandal in the beginning of 2017.
François Fillon,
so they would
more
be
right
quite
wing
happy.
rather than far right wing leader. Yeah,
absolutely. And they looked at the public opinion polls. They saw that in the standoff between Fillon and Le Pen, Fillon would have won. So and Fillon made several statements that were considered quite friendly towards Putin's Russia. So they would have been very happy to have Fillon. But then Macron appeared. He was propelled into the first in the top level of the public opinion polls, and only then they decided to support Le Pen.
And just finally, very briefly, I mean, how does it help, or does it help, do you think, the far-right parties in Europe? I mean, if they're seen as being close to Vladimir Putin, is that a help or is that a hindrance?
You see, domestic audiences, this is something that I got a very idea, is that domestic audiences in the EU, they don't really care about foreign affairs. They look at the domestic problems and what politicians say about them domestically, not international affairs. So for many people, far-right politicians being close to Vladimir Putin or offering praise of Vladimir Putin, this is a sign of the anti-establishment sentiment. And some people who feel that they are against the establishment, that they are against the so-called ruling elites, for them, this approach is quite positive. Yeah, so if mainstream politicians are criticizing Vladimir Putin's Russia, and then you have right-wing or left-wing populists who are offering praise of this, this is just part of the anti-establishment populist message. So it works well with some elements of the society.
Great to talk to you today. Thanks very much for joining us on the programme. The book, then, Russia and the Western Far-Right, Tango Noir. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
The main news headlines then. The world's major G20 economies coming together for a special summit today to discuss aid and security after the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. The country struggling with drought and severe poverty. Iraq's Shiite Muslim cleric Muqtada al-Sadr's party, the biggest winner in parliamentary results from elections there. Elsewhere, though, other Shiite parties faring less well, meaning the future in the country far from certain. And the British government waited too long to impose a lockdown in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, missing a chance to contain the disease and leading to thousands of unnecessary deaths. Those are the conclusions of a new parliamentary report.